With so many licensed Warhammer video games out there now, and I could count on one hand which ones I would actually consider good games, why should you care about a pixelated boomer shooter that looks like it belongs in the late 90s? Well, I'll tell you why. And who am I? I'm Ross, and this is Warhammer Videos. Back in 1996, you would hear arguments in the playground at school over which games console was better, PlayStation or N64. Fights would actually break out over what were the better games, Resident Evil 2 or Castlevania, Gran Turismo or Mario Kart, Final Fantasy 7 or Ocarina of Time, Tekken 3 or Killer Instinct. Alright, that last one was obvious. And all these games looked beautiful at the time, but do you know what everyone was playing that year? The original Pokemon. And that was the year I realised that graphics don't matter. Gameplay is everything. And this is something that Auroch Digital have proven with Boltgun, because it's not just a good Warhammer game. This licensed Games Workshop release is also a great video game. And it's been about 14 years since the last one. Now generally PC games are the least optimised of any release lately, but this is flawless. And as you may spot from the ratio of this video, the game natively supports ultra-wide 21:9, though this puts key info like the Servo Skull updates in your peripheral vision. Despite the retro aesthetic, there's still a small myriad of quality options that are quite modern, including full HDR support, just to ensure that every muzzle flash is ingrained into your retina. Though I recorded footage with HDR off, as I can't figure out how to capture it in OBS. For those not too keen on the pixelated style, you do have controls to adjust both the overlay and the colour texture palette. Turning these off entirely still doesn't provide you with graphics on par with a modern shooter, but it does allow you to scale the style from something like Quake 2 at its sharpest to someone attempting a shooter built on an 8-bit console. The former of which is what I used and how I captured the majority of this video, so it's not quite as pixelated as most may think. As for my rig, well, it's an RTX water-cooled beast, but I doubt it'll be taxing on many systems. For a more relative reference, let's just say it runs fine on a Steam Deck, despite Steam warning me that this is untested as far as I can see. There were no Steam Deck setting profiles in the game, but I was still able to boot it up and play and dive right in. But my preferred way to play is on mouse and keyboard, for a very specific reason which I'll come back to shortly, and no, it's not just an arrogant PC master race rules kind of thing. For the story, you play an Ultramarine Stern Guard veteran, Malum Kado, Malum, it doesn't actually say it in the game, so I'm not sure. And your mission, if you choose to accept it, is to single-handedly break into a fortress and steal a crystal from a wizard.
Haha! Up yours!
However, and spoiler alert I guess, that pretty much is the whole story. I'm not going to spoil how it ends, but just like Doom 2016, the narrative arc in this game is borderline meaningless. Whilst the intro cinematic shows a drop pod hurtling towards the Forge world of Graia, there isn't even much of a narrative connection between this and the first ounce of gameplay where you land in a scene that could do with an audio clip explaining "Everybody's dead, Dave." All of your Marine brothers lay dead around you, but up until that point it wasn't actually clear that Kado was deployed with any other Marines. That explanation of the intro scene is pretty much how the story is delivered throughout. It isn't. But when you're having this much fun, who cares? Now, it may be that your Servo Skull companion, Incommodus, is providing story moments throughout the game, but with these comments being delivered off my peripheral vision, without much of a clear audio cue and scrolling on screen so painstakingly slow, or when you're mid-battle, you're so quickly trained to just ignore them. The few times I did try to read them, the info it gives includes "here's a health pack" or "here's some ammo," despite me being full on both counts. As I said though, what matters most is the gameplay. I only covered the story because, well, I've seen other reviewers break down reviews into such sections, and since this is my first foray as a video game reviewer, I want to do my best at faking knowing what I'm doing. How's it going so far? Let me know in the comments. The gameplay is surprisingly fast, and I say that because for years these licensed games have been so bogged down in the lore. Space Marine movement speed is the prime example. They're not typically agile cyber warriors, but more like walking tanks, just as they're described in the opening chapters of Horus Rising. But in this game, your default speed is much quicker than other games have typically depicted. You can run, jump, charge, and even mantle. However, the weight is conveyed incredibly strongly in both the audio design and the gamepad rumble. You feel agile and heavy at the same time. But when you sprint, the speed doubles and you suddenly become a lightning fast but slightly floaty, unstoppable machine. You are trained to use the sprint button early on in the game, as obtaining your first key requires agility. You do have a charge button for a quick boost forward, but I'm yet to find a use for it in game. But that's because I quickly learned of my preferred way to play through this 12 to 20 hour campaign. I played through the first level on a gamepad so I can try out both control styles, and I quickly learned it was quite difficult to both hold the sprint button and navigate to get this key. Thankfully, I'd spotted earlier in the menus that you can switch this from hold to toggle. When I moved over to mouse and keyboard for level 2, I'd left the toggle on, and as soon as I enabled run, I realised just how fast my character had become, and it changed the whole game experience. It was now a rapid fire twitch shooter, and it was awesome. There's no stamina gauge, so you can't run out, you just endlessly run and gun. Rip and tear. I was so excited about my discovery that as soon as I saw somebody else had the game before release, I had to reach out to them to tell them about it. And that person was KDO's very own voice actor, Rahul Kohli. And he even responded. I guess this means we're best friends now. Now, it would be fair to say that Rahul absolutely nails the voice acting.
For terror and the Emperor, I smell demon filth. The enemies of the Imperium will taste death this day.
Though, in all honesty, due to the filter applied, you can only just about tell that it's him. And unfortunately, you can actually play through the entire game without hearing him utter a single syllable. His role isn't included with any of the story cinematics, his lines are only invoked when using the taunt button. But with no multiplayer option, there's very little value in this function. I could determine no boost to your attributes when this was used, nor would it cause any reaction from your AI opponents. Nevertheless, I used it semi-frequently, normally at the start of a boss battle or when throwing a grenade. It did feel quite badass to loose a frag, taunt your enemy and watch them become mush. Because in the grim darkness of the far future, there is only mush. This game is gory. Well, as gory as you can consider different shades of red pixel as gore. So, no matter how you dispatch your opponents from one of the 8 weapon types in the game, along with the 3 grenade types and a chainsword, each one of them's all going to end with the same result. The weapons thankfully all make sense both in the game and in the Warhammer lore, but the shotgun initially felt a bit weak. In the early game you're given this just before a few tight corridors, which makes sense for close range weapons, but the firing cone is pretty narrow and there's not much in terms of bullet penetration. I felt I often had expected it to hit 2 or more targets with a single shot, only to feel like the weapon has homing rounds and hit whichever enemy was closer. It works fairly decently as a weapon from mid to long range distance too. And then there's the plasma rifle, which is slower firing, high damage, but keep your distance from projectiles when they land because there's a splash area of effect that will hurt you too. The heavy bolter is a rapid fire weapon that tears through some of the toughest opponents, but firing takes time to warm up and slows your movement when in use. But the most versatile weapon throughout, even in the endgame, is always your trusty bolter, which never feels weak and is frequently imbued with the power of upgrades. And it's so easy to understand when you're running low on ammo, thanks to the clear audio cue from this mechanical Deathbringer. And grenades are fun too, with both yours and enemy grenades showing their impact radius before detonation. Just like plasma though, your own grenades will hurt you too, so be careful where and when you launch them. But it is worth knowing that the game has a great way of determining who you're wanting to throw them at. From close range to chasmous distances or even on a vertical plane, landing a grenade at the right enemy's feet feels incredibly intuitive. And the chainsword is a perfect addition to the game because it can be utilised at any time, though with a small cooldown just to avoid chain kills. When holding this and keeping it down so that it revs it to the point you lock onto an opponent, you'll then see time slow as you commit to your move by releasing the trigger. The Rahul Marine will then leap great distances to melee your foe. Though I quickly learned on PC when you lunge to attack, you can actually spam V and the right mouse button because both are assigned to melee and chain interrupt many of the opponents to their death. Please don't tell the devs about this one, it's really useful. Now, when it comes to level design, or at least encounter design, Auroch Digital gets right what so many other games get wrong, and I don't just mean Warhammer games, but several AAAs too. Unlike everyone's beloved Space Marine game, which, let's be honest, is encounter after encounter, maybe it's an open field, maybe it's corridors, Space Marine will just send hordes of enemies at you from all directions most of the time. In some ways, it feels a bit more Dynasty Warriors than Gears of War, and with few of the remaining elements of either of those games to make it actually enjoyable. If you love Warhammer, then you probably love Space Marine, but if you love video games, you probably realise that Space Marine is okay. Here, every encounter, most of which seamlessly merge, has been carefully thought out and planned for you to have a good experience. Remember Halo's 30 seconds of fun approach? This is that, but instead of being rewarded with a vista or some advance in the story, you're frequently rewarded with another, even bigger encounter. Most of your downtime is only the loading screen between levels. Think of Space Hulk Deathwing for the 8 of you that played it, which should have been Vermintide on a Space Hulk. It had beautiful set designs, but again, just a nonsensical slew of monsters, and it quickly teaches you not to bother with any encounter-to-encounter tactics, instead just accept the inevitable swarm that you'll soon be surrounded with in no time. So you may as well just stand there and hold the trigger while slowly turning around. Each encounter in Boltgun feels like it's been considered to incredible depth. There's no sign of throw together in here. This game tastes like it's been playtested to death, with the developers constantly asking each other, was that fun? Well, if the answer was no, okay, how do we tweak it? And the true answer to that question is delivered countless times in the game you pay for here. As for the actual environment design though, especially if you get into the late game, you start to realise the need for better navigation. This game does so much to take the classic Doom-esque gameplay loop and add modern elements like lunging, reloading, heck, even having to consider enemies on the vertical plane is new compared to the original 16-bit shooter. And for the most part, the game does a good job at leading you in the right direction. Typically, if there's enemies that way, you're on the right track, but every so often you'll be put into a kill box and asked to purge it. For the early stages of the game, these are quite large box environments. You come in at one end, you need to progress through the enemies before the door unlocks at the other end. But as you progress, these arenas quickly become self-contained spiralling chasms with a multitude of tiered corridors and stairways. One level of teleporting doors is so complex that it would confuse MC Escher. By the time you've finished many encounters, having completed your purging, you'll be left somewhere random with little idea of where the entrance was and even less idea of where to go next. Somewhere in this maze will have been a blocked door during the encounter. You may have spotted it, but in the very likely event you haven't, your only solution is to aimlessly wander through doorways until you find something that looks new. Difficult when many of the corridors look so similar. A crude design fix for this would be to have the game identify when you're lost based on time spent in a specific area, and a big arrow should point you to the relevant doorway to the next arena. Ideally, it should be the level design that makes progression more obvious by embellishing the progression point with more eye-drawing art styles, or having an event such as a fixed enemy emplacement pulling you towards that area right at the end. Perhaps even making your Servitor Skull companion actually useful and have it guide you. It's not the worst issue in the world, and Auroch have done so much good in this game by making it fun, but these moments of backtrack guessing become a little too frequent and frustrating. I don't want to hammer this point home, but I have to because it's obvious all over the shop. Things like lighting and buttons is another slight hang-up. Your first and really the only puzzle in the game, as mentioned earlier, is to sprint down a corridor to get a red key. But when you've got this, you need to slightly backtrack to figure out where to use it. On my first playthrough of this game at Warhammer Fest, I ended up back at the starting location before I eventually found it in the room just before the sprint puzzle. The problem is, this button that you have to press now you have the key had a red glow around it. So does the door, but it's around the whole door and the wall, which is disguised further by the red glow being given off by your servo skull and the overall grim red hue of the environment. A later level, which is essentially one giant elevator, gives little indication of where to head at the end of each encounter. When I found what I thought was the way, I subsequently left because I couldn't see that there was a button for an airlock in the periphery of my screen. Another 10 minutes of searching before I went back and found it. The TLDR here is I think more could have been done to draw the eye in these few moments, but you won't need to worry about that. By the time you play it, there will be already guides up online. I'm happy though that I got the true 90s experience of having to figure it out for myself. And I did feel a little spike of pride every time I realised this is the way.
This is the way.
This is the way. This is the way.
There is a bit more to do than just run and gun, so it's worth talking about the unlockables. There is a bit of an endgame in this title. At any point you can replay unlocked levels and achieve one of 3 accolades in that level: completion difficulty, 100% kills, or 100% secrets found. For the secrets themselves, these could be found just off the beaten path or hidden in random containers. Some require tests of your platforming agility, but others are in plain sight, as in you walk into a typical room and it's right there looking at you. And it appeared not every secret gave you a power-up, but every power-up was considered a secret, no matter how obvious its placement was. And still now, at the end of the game, I have no idea what most of these do. It does tell you somewhere in the menus, but I can't remember that, I'm nearly 40. In my first playthrough, I would find most of these just after an enemy encounter, so it'd be almost useless and depleted by the time I got to the next one. But for completionists replaying the level, knowing their locations ahead of time could give you a sore needed edge on the higher difficulties. I think many of these could have just been teased a lot better and encouraged you to try out some platforming throughout the whole game. I was only able to locate 2 of the secrets hidden behind walls, and that was just thanks to the pop-up of press E as I passed them, and I don't look forward to searching these huge sprawling levels for more. A lot of the time I would achieve some great platforming feats, and there was nothing there, even when those platforming elements seemed pretty deliberate. Perhaps the secrets only come up on certain difficulty levels. I honestly don't know, I haven't found them all yet, and I haven't played on every single difficulty. But even when you unlock all these things, it doesn't actually give you anything other than a little icon on the level select screen. I do feel slightly that there's an easily missed opportunity where they could have had unlockables. I mean, we're creators who want to play this game, we want to be inspired. They could have given us concept art, pictures, developer diaries, loads of things, but unfortunately there's none of that here, and it feels a little bit missed. And there are plenty of enemies to take out on your journey, from the initial slew of cultists to Chaos Space Marines. There's also a multitude of varieties of demons from Siege and Nurgle, and even armoured bloat drones, and each has its own attack pattern, and in some cases a few. Projectiles are generally a bit slower than in most shooters, giving you time to visually evade as you launch rounds back at your foes. It's almost an R-type style mechanic, but in a shooter, and it adds to the badass feeling of being able to dodge bullets. However, the distribution of enemies and even weapons throughout the 3 chapters feels a little bit unbalanced. Not bad, not low, just unbalanced. And the delivery at times is a little weak. Your first bloat drone just appears in the air when you reach a certain point in a level, but then shortly later it becomes a mini-boss in a purge encounter. Really, that purge encounter would have been a better place to deliver it for the first time and maybe increase the health, just to give you the idea that this is a big threat. As the game rolls out new enemies and weapons, there's a bit of a gap towards the end levels of Chapter 1 and even the beginning of Chapter 2, where very little feels new except the environment. Then all of a sudden, you get a lot at once. In the final chapter, I believe there's only 1 new enemy type revealed. But I want to be careful and deliberate with this point of critique, because I'm not saying at all that there wasn't enough, I'm specifically saying that I wanted more. And if any experience can leave me wanting more, then surely it's done its job. So well done, Auroch Digital. For those of us who enjoy this style of shooter, you've made an absolutely fantastic one. So when can we get some info about Boltgun 2? There'd better be a Boltgun 2. And thanks to everyone for watching. I doubt this review is going to convince anybody to get the game, because if you like the look of this type of shooter and you like Warhammer, you're probably going to get it anyway. I suppose what I want to convey with this video is that it's a good one. It's not going to be one that you end up getting and then become immediately disappointed with, like Underworlds was. If you did like this video and appreciate it, then please, I would very much appreciate a comment down below, because that would help me convince other companies to give me early access to free games too, and I'd really like that. Don't forget to hit like, subscribe, and the notification bell so that you can be informed of future videos. Until next time, thanks again for watching. Fohammer out. Love you guys.